Hey guys, welcome to Code Decode. In this video, we are going to see everything about request param, path variables, their differences. This is a very common question which is being asked nowadays in interview. This is the most basic one, but it's the most trickiest one also with the REST APIs. Also, we're going to see this example integrated with Spring Boot 3 and Java 17. So let's see with a live demo what is the difference between them. How do you decide when to use what? So let's get started. Please do like, share and subscribe this video, as your like and subscription actually helps this video to reach to more of the people preparing for interviews and rank it better with the YouTube algorithm. So please do it. It's really important for us. Thank you. Let's get started. Hey guys, recently we have launched a course covering an end-to-end full stack application using Angular as front end and microservices and Spring Boot as the back end. Also, we have used Cloud to deploy this application, and we have used CICD, that is Jenkins and Argo CD, for continuous integration and continuous deployment. The technologies that we have used is RESTful web services, Spring Boot and microservices for backend, Angular for front end. GitHub we have used for version control system. Also, to make the code unit testable, we have used JUnits. We have used Sonar for code quality checks. Also, for containerization, we have used Docker and Kubernetes. And to deploy this whole application, we have used AWS and multiple services from AWS. Also, we have used SQL as well as NoSQL, that is MongoDB and SQL. On AWS, since for the SQL we have RDS, we have used those services, and Jenkins and Argo CD for CI/CD pipeline. Also, this is an architecture of the application that we have created where the front end is Angular and the back end is microservices. We have used ALB load balancers, Ingress for routing and load balancing, and we have used SQL and MongoDB for SQL and NoSQL DB management with Eureka server and all those microservices counterparts. Now this is the CI/CD pipeline. This is the CI/CD flowchart for the application that we have created on local. So this is something, a flow when you create an application in local, push it to GitHub, create a Jenkins pipeline and do the CI/CD using Jenkins and Argo CD. And at the end, deploy the whole code at AWS EKS. Complete description of this course is covered in a very separate video. The link for that video is also given in the description bar below. And also the link to purchase that course from Udemy is also in the description bar below. So please go and check the description for all these links. So this is a demo project I have created for you. In the pom.xml, you can see we have been using Spring Boot 3.1.5 version with Java 17. You can see some Jakarta differences here. That's the maximum difference you can find with Spring Boot 3. Now we have REST controller. We have the get mapping with the get employee method. Also, we have the Postman collection ready for you for the demo purpose. Now let's get started and see what is request param, what is path param. So here in my example, I have given both request param and path param in a single URL so that you can differentiate what is request param, what is path param, and then we will see when to use what. So first, let's see that this is a URL, localhost 8080 employees / if you can see, this is curly braces. Whatever in the curly braces is a part of URL becomes the path variable. And whatever after question marks, everything with after an ampersand, key value pair is request pair. So request param is always a key value pair. Key is the startYear, value is the 2023. Key is the gender, value is the female. Path parameter usually identifies a specific resource. So when you have to identify a resource uniquely, there is the path parameter. And when you have to give some additional information or filter criteria. So here in my example, out of all thousands of employees, I need to uniquely identify an employee. So that becomes the path parameter with the employee ID. But I want to filter only those employees who started this year 2023 and only those who are male or female. These filters becomes the request parameter or the query parameter. So when you want to identify uniquely, use path parameter. When you want to give the additional information or the filter criteria, use the query parameter or the request parameter as a key value pair. So here we have used the filter as startYear and gender, both. Now, a very good question, when to use what? You can always give the employee ID also here as EMP ID and here 101. you can always do that, or 202. So when to use what? Remove this from here. Then also you will be able to fetch only those employees whose employee ID is 101. No, why to give it as a path parameter? Also, what you can do is you can give slash 2023 slash mail and use it in your logic to fetch those employees whose employee ID is 101 slash 2023 slash mail. So both can be used interchangeably. Now, how will you decide which to use when? When should you use path param? When to use key value pair as request param? So whenever you want to extract some optional parameters or you have some filter criteria, use @request param. And on the other hand, whenever you want to extract the mandatory parameters, that is, whenever you are fetching the list of employees, at least fetch this 101 employee list data. So this is unique identification of an employee. Now you want to filter using some filter criteria, like it should have a start date as 2023 and it should be a male candidate. Then that should be the request param. I'll give you an example. Here I have to get an employee detail. Here I'm providing an employee ID. So this is a unique employee fetch. And request parameters are start date and gender. This is the filter criteria. So whenever I'm going to fetch anything from an employee database, I'll be fetching the employee details for this employee only. So this is unique identification of a resource on a database. I have thousands of employees. I need to fetch the detail only and only for 101 employee. Now I want to fetch only the date of employee when he has started in 2023 and is a male candidate. Else give me null. In such scenarios, when you want to filter some criteria, use request parameter. So this is a very common misconception that you can use anything anywhere, but you should use it logically. This is the logic behind using the path variable and request parameter. Additional or filter criteria should always be used with the request parameter. And when there is a mandatory resource finding criteria, use it in the URL path itself. So now it's clear when to use what. Now let's quickly see the differences between path param and request param. So first of all, you can directly see the usage. When you want to fetch the data from the URL with some filter criteria. So here we have some filter criteria. Filter on the basis of start date and gender. Then use request param. Else, when you want to extract the exact value from the URL path, then go for path variable. So you can see here, this is the part of URL path itself, while the request parameters are not the part of path of URL. These are just the part of these parameters. So you can pass it like these. These are just the parameters to URL. These are not the path in the URL. Only the path is still here till 101. Now location, where does request parameter lies? Request parameter you can see here lies after question mark. While where does the path variable lies? It lies in the curly braces here. So these curly braces encompasses the path variable. So that's how you can distinguish between path variable and query parameters. Query parameters will always be followed by a question mark. And multiple, if you have multiple query parameters, they will be appended with ampersand. This. Now let's come to required status for request parameter. So for the request parameter, you can explicitly set it to required equals to false, which you cannot do with path variables. Now when you set it to required equals to false, then by default it is set to null. Or when you define some default value, then it will be set to that particular default value. So suppose I said default value is 2000. The default value will be in string. It will be converted to integer later on. So let's see, when it is required false, then it should be default to value 2000. And since we do not give any default value to gender, it should be null. So let's see how it works. Let's not send any request parameter. So the request parameter, the start year and gender is not here. Let's try hitting it. The debug comes here and you can see here the employee ID is 101, that is from the path variable. The start year is set to 2000, which is by default, and the gender is set to null. That was what was expected. So it is set to null if it is required as false and you don't give it. And if its value is default if it is specified as default. So let's see what is the response we get. So we get the proper response, 101, which is the path variable, 2000, which was given default in the code base. So here we have given a default value, and gender as null since there was no default set. So the required status is set to null or default value if you set it as required false, but by default it is required equals to true. While in the case of path variable, it is by default required equals to true and will give you 404 if not specified. Now handling multiple values for request param and path variable. For path variable, typically there is only for the single use. You cannot have multiple values like 101, 102. You do not usually do that. If you still want to do that, what you have to do is, it's a complicated process. The process can be, you can send it in the string format, then separate it using the comma separation, and then make it as a list and do it. While in the case of handling multiple values with request param, it is far more easy. You can take it in array or list. So how do you do it in the code? So we have the second get mapping where we have /users, and we can take request parameters as a list of users. So let's try hitting it. So this is the list example where I have multiple users. This is going to be hit here. Then you have multiple users ID. The users ID will be mapped to list of long. Here you have comma separated values. So here you pass the values here 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how you pass comma separated values, which will be fetched as the list in the Java. So handling list or multiple values with request parameter is far more easy as compared to the path parameter. So let's try hitting it now. The debugger comes here and you can see list is having the size of 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can get the data as 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is how handling multiple values is far more easy with the request parameter, while it is typically very difficult with path variable, and which is very significantly good also, because what we have started with was the path variable is used to uniquely define a resource. To uniquely define, you do not give a list. You always define one value which uniquely defines that resource. So usually you have the one employee distinguished. So one employee will be in the path variable as 101. You do not usually pass 101, 102, 103. That is the filter criteria that fetch from employee list, filtering 101, 102, 103, 104 employees. That's the filter criteria. So when you have multiple values, go for request parameter because that is filter criteria. But when you have a single value and you need to uniquely identify that, always go for path variable. So that is why I say you can do both. You can use it in path variable also, you can use it in request param also. But go with the logic. Uniquely identification, mandatory field, go with path variable. Filter criteria, additional information, go with the request parameter. Now next, encoding. Both request parameter and path variable is capable enough to decode your encoded data. Now whenever you hit something from the front end and you send your first name and the last name with a space separation. So the space comes as encoded. Now how would you decode it? So it automatically decodes it for you. I'll give an example. Now suppose my ID is code percentile decode and my request parameter is also codes percentile decode. Now how would my REST controller would look like? Since this user slash ID becomes the user slash ID as the path of the URL, but this code percentile decode will become the path variable name, and this path variable name will be mapped here with the @path variable annotation. So this code percentile 20 is nothing but the space encoding. So this will come as code space decode and not code percentile 20 decode. Similarly, the request parameter will not be a part of your path. It will rather be annotated with @request param, and the request param will be mapped with req param name. Req param name will be the name of this variable here in the method parameter. So this will be mapped to this, while this will be mapped to this. Since it's a part of path, you will be matching this variable with the path variable name. While since request parameter is not a part of your path in the URL, this name will be mapped in the key in the URL. Now let's try hitting it with code space decode, which is encoded here in the URL, but it should be decoded here automatically in this @path variable, @request param REST method. So let's try hitting it. So here it comes. And you can see here, it's code space decode. And this request parameter is code space decode, not code percentile decode. Let's see in the response also. So here in the response, it's code space decode, code space decode. So here you are sending it in encoded format of space is encoded as percentile 20, but it is automatically decoded automatically. So that's the best part of it. From the UI front end, you can send it encoded. We will be able to decode it for you. Now, when it comes to flexibility in URL structure, whenever at some point of time, I want to change the structure in the URL. So I want to add one more, the project ID. So you can add it here as project ID as 1. You do not have to change the URL structure. URL still remains http localhost 8080 employee/101, which is good enough to uniquely identify a 101 employee in the database. Just the filter parameter is changing, so you don't have to change the URL structure. Hence, the request parameter is flexible. But when it comes to path variable, you have to specify the structure strictly. So when I want to send the project ID here as /1 as the project ID, then your URL changes and hence your code base also changes. Here in the code base, you have to modify your get mapping and you have to get it as /curly braces project ID. If you want to add the project ID here in the URL as 101/1. So now here it will be employee ID as 101, project ID will be 1. So it's not that flexible. You have to adhere and change the URL structure when you have to add something in the path variable. So affect on the path structure, yes, it does not affect the path structure. Here you can see in the request parameter, you do not have to change the structure. But in the path variable, the presence of a path variable directly affects the structure of the URI path. Now handling the form data. I was talking something about the front end. So when you have multiple fields from the front end coming for the employee, so suppose employee ID, project ID, employee name, employee last name, marital status, address, all these hundreds of fields are coming from the form data. Now, how do you handle? Usually, these data are used to filter the data for employee when you have the get information. So usually the form data in these many numbers are usually handled using request parameter and they are not handled using the path variable. Why? Otherwise, your URL will become as localhost 8080/employee/employee ID 1 / its address / its mobile number / which is so bad, so complicated. How would you manage it? So typically it's not, the form data is never sent as a part of path variable. It's always sent as a part of request parameter. So it's very easy to add multiple key value pair here as the form data, but it's very difficult to add /mobile number 587 something something /. So it's very difficult to do that here as a URL. So never do that with URL, rather do it with the request parameter when you want to send some form data to backend. Also, there is one more very important difference, that is the ordering. So request parameter does not have the strict ordering. What I can do is I can send the start date later on and send the gender first. So let's try doing it. So suppose I'm sending the gender as the first parameter and start date as second. So here you can see I'm sending the gender as first parameter and start year as second. So will that modify my response? Answer should be no, because it's key value pair. This gender is getting mapped to this gender and this year is getting mapped to this start year. So basically your order does not matter. So let's try hitting it and you can see we have the proper response. Start date is 2023 and gender is male. It's not that your order here for fetching your request parameter should match the order in the URL. It's not the case. You can send it anywhere. It doesn't matter. It just matches the keys which is present here with the key that you send here in the request parameter name. But in the case of path variable, the order matters a lot. What happens is you have employee ID and project ID. So you have @path variable, long project ID, and we are appending in the response also as project ID. Now here I'm sending as 101 as employee ID, 1 as project ID. So what will happen? Let's debug it again. Your employee ID 101 will be mapped to here 101 and your project ID 1 will be mapped here. So let's try hitting it. Your employee ID is 101, project ID is 1. Now in case if I reverse the values, like we have done it for the request parameter. We have made the gender first, start date second. If I made project ID as 1 as a first part in the URL and 101 as employee ID is a second, then what will happen? Then your employee ID will become 1 and your project ID becomes 101. You can see it here. You can see the employee ID becomes 1 because this employee ID is mapped to the one which is directly after employee's path. Hence, the order matters in case of path variable, but order doesn't matter in the request param. Why? Because it's mapped with the key value pair and not directly with what is coming in order in the URL. Now, the last difference is complexity. Request param is generally very more simple and human readable. So here you can directly see, looking at just this URL, you know that gender is male, start date is 2023. It's too much human readable. But the path variable is very much complex, and when you have multiple path variables, you cannot identify which is for what. So here looking at /employees1/101, what do you understand? One is employee ID or one is the project ID? 101 is project ID or 101 is the employee ID? You do not get much information when it comes to path variables. So that is why restrict yourself whenever you are using the path variables, because you do not know what is 1, what is 101. It's not human readable. But when you use the request mapping, you directly can see, yes, gender as male and start year is 2023. So this is much more human readable and this is nowhere near to human readable. I do not know what is 1, what is 101. So this is how you distinguish between the request param and the path variable. And deciding between them is also very complicated. Whenever you have something which is mandatory, go for path variable. If you have some filter and additional information, go for a request param. So that was all about the difference between them. If you want more such tricky questions on the REST controllers, REST APIs, just let us know in the comment section. We'll create more such tricky parts. Thank you.